As promised last week, I said that one of the things that I wanted to try to do, after we talked about the story of the rabbis in Bnei Brak, is to take a look at one part of the actual dense portion of the Haggadah and try to expand and expound upon it in a way that enhances its meaning and significance. And that, I believe, is really the work that we should be trying to do when it comes to the Seder. The part of the Seder that we're going to be looking at, the part of Haggadah that we're going to be looking at today, is the one that's the most often overlooked, because it's not the fun part. It's not the four sons, it's not the Dayenu, there's no song, there's no, right, there's no little kid. It's the end, it's the dipping comes in at the end. And it's the part that we rush through the most because we want to get to that, dipping part and to the Dayenu part and then to the matzah part. But I think it's critical that we try our best. It's also that part, we use the Goldberg, those red, gold. Some people use the Maxwell House, we use the Goldberg ones.
Totally.
And it's the part with the really small font that it's almost saying like, this isn't so important, run through it. As opposed to, when you get to Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, Rabbi Gamliel, it's in like huge letters. So we're going to redeem, we're going to elevate, we're going to reveal how some of the small font parts are equally interesting and important and significant. That's our goal for today. Welcome. We're about to start. Perfect timing.
Okay, good.
There you go. Let's pull a couple of more chairs.
So pull the chair up. Right here.
Okay. So here's where we're going to begin. First, I want to outline where the impetus for this research and eventually this shiur came from. It was really from a comment that the Rambam makes in Hilchot Chametz U'Matzah, which is the first source in the packet. I'm sorry, there's a lot of writing and it's a little dense, but hopefully we won't be overwhelmed. The Rambam, in the very first source in your packet, says something really important, and basically I viewed it as a charge and a mandate to try to really expound upon some of the overlooked parts of the Haggadah. The Rambam first tells us about the narrative device of the storytelling at the Seder, which we're going to come back to at the end. V'tzarich lahatchil, it's right there, it's that one, yeah. V'tzarich lahatchil, the Rambam says, bignut u'lesayim b'shevach. You have to tell the story of the Exodus by beginning with shame or disgrace or ignominy.
Ignominious.
What?
Ignominy.
No, ignominy?
Yes, ignominy.
Ignominy, okay. The bad stuff, the down times, the not such good times. U'lesayim b'shevach. And then you do the glory, the praise, the good times. That's the narrative device that's central to the Seder, and something we're going to come back to. Why is that narrative device so important, and what really does it mean? And do we really do that at the Seder? We're going to see it's more complicated. How do you do that, the Rambam says? V'hu sheyidrosh me'arami oved avi. You do that by extrapolating or analyzing, the best translation is probably darshaning, the psukim of Arami Oved Avi. Really expounding upon those psukim, delving into them. Right? And that's what we have in the Seder. We have 4 psukim lined up, one after the other. The 4 psukim are a capsule version of Jewish history that the farmer would express when there was a temple, when he brought his first fruits to the temple. It's called Parshat HaBikurim, the paragraph of the Bikurim. It's also known as the Parsha of Arami Oved Avi, because it begins with those words, a wandering Aramean was my father, which the Haggadah takes as a reference to Lavan, but probably in the Pshat seems to be referring to Abraham and Jacob, who were wandering people in Aram. And the Rambam says that's the tool, that's the text, and that's the raw material for telling this narrative. Ad she'igmor kol parsha, until you finish the whole parsha. Now the truth is, nowadays, at some point after the destruction of the second temple, we took out the last pasuk. The Haggadah removed the last pasuk of that parsha because the last pasuk in that parsha triumphantly ends with Vayiviyenu el hamakom hazeh, and you brought us to this place, namely Eretz Yisrael and the Beit HaMikdash, and we're bringing you these first fruits. We cut that out because it was no longer true. We were exiled, and therefore we have 4 psukim, and we're going to look at the last pasuk. And then the Rambam says something which, again, is our charge for today. The cholamosif umarich bidrash parshazu harei zeh meshubach. And all who add and expand or extend in the analysis of this parsha, that person is praiseworthy. The more, and this is the challenge. We have this fixed text, and it's a little bit dense and hard to get through. But from the Rambam, it sounds like that's what we should be spending our time on. That's what we should be expounding upon and trying to figure out and analyze and mine for nuggets of significance. And so that's what we're going to try to do. We're not going to look at all 4 psukim and all the drashot. That would take us a whole Seder night. That's probably what those sages in Bnei Brak were doing all night. We're going to look at just one part of the last pasuk and just the second half of drashot on that pasuk, with the hope of deepening our understanding of matchil bignut u'mesayim b'shabach, really trying to understand what this narrative device really is all about, number 1. Number 2, really trying to understand how Arami Oved Avi helps achieve the goal of this narrative device. And also along the way, and here's the ambitious part, I believe we're going to uncover 2 narratives, maybe even dueling narratives, that are right there embedded in the text of the Haggadah, which we sometimes overlook. And I want to try to understand the significance of those 2 narratives. So let's begin on our journey in terms of trying to understand one opaque passage of the drashot in the Haggadah. So the pasuk we're going to look at, we're going to start with the next text, the Haggadah Shel Pesach, the actual text of the Haggadah. This is from the Ashkenazi Haggadah, the very end of the Midrash of Arami Oved Avi, and it begins with a citation of the pasuk. Vayotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim biyad chazaka b'zro netuya v'morah gadol uvotot umoftim. That's a quote from the pasuk Dvarim Chavav Chet. It means, and he took us out of Egypt. God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, with great awe or manifestation, and with signs and with wonders. Okay? The Haggadah then goes on to talk about how it was just God and nobody else. You remember that drasha? Lo al yedei malach, lo al yedei saraf, ani hu v'lo acher, right? That drasha actually a lot of people spend time talking about because it raises the question, why isn't Moshe more prominent in the Haggadah? Why does it seem like we limit Moshe's mentioning? Is mentioned in passing only once. That people focus on. Anything that people focus on, we're not focusing on today. We're going to try to focus on something that nobody focuses on. Because the part we're about to read, it may ring a bell, but I challenge all of us here, if we've ever spent time at the Seder, actually expounding upon this section. So what does the Haggadah then do? The Haggadah then spells out from the 5 terms that appear in this verse what that has to do with the exodus from Egypt. So follow along. You can look either in the Hebrew or in the English, which is right below. Biyad chazakah. What is the term yad chazakah, with a mighty hand? That's a reference, the Haggadah says, zo hadever. That refers to pestilence or cattle plague. Kamash and Emar, and then the Haggadah uses a parallel verse drasha. This drasha is not explanatory per se. It just connects. It's an associative drasha. It connects the word yad chazakah to the term dever. And it shows where those two words appear in the Tanakh and allow us to make the drasha. Kema shenemar hinei yad Hashem hoya b'miknecha asher basadeh basusim b'chamarim b'agmalim b'abakar batzon dever kaved ma'od. So through the association of the word yad and the word dever, we interpret yad chazakah to mean dever. Ubizroa nituya, and with an outstretched arm, zo hacherev. This refers to the sword. Kama shenamar v'charba shlufa b'yado nituya al Yerushalayim. A pasuk in Divrei Hayamim. His sword was drawn in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem. Again, having nothing to do with, doesn't have anything to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim per se, but it shows how there's an association between nituya and cherev. Uvimora gadol, and with great awe manifestation, zo gilui shchina. This is a reference to God revealing Himself, the divine presence being revealed. Kema shenemar, oinis hanisa lokim vo lakachlo goy mikarev goy b'masot b'otod moftim u'b'melchama u'b'yad chazakah v'zor netiyah u'b'mora'im gedolim kechol asher asa lachem Hashem Elokechem b'mitzrayim le'inecha. This is a strange pasuk because it doesn't actually work. It mentions mora'im gedolim, but it never mentions gilui shchina. So a lot of people have a problem with that. We're going to leave that aside for now. Uvelo tot. What's that a reference to? The signs. That's the mateh. Zeh hamateh, that refers to the staff. Kama shenemar, vet hamateh zeh tikach biyadecha asher taseh bo ta'otot. Uvemoftim, lastly, the fifth term in the verse, that's a reference to the dam, to the blood. Kama shenemar, v'natati moftim b'shamayim ba'aretz dam va'esh v'timrot ashan. And that's when we start with the dipping. Then the Haggadah continues. Just below, I bolded it or I shaded it in gray. Davar acher. So why did I become obsessed with this part of the Haggadah? Not just because it's overlooked, but also because this is the only time in that whole section of the Haggadah that we have this term davar acher, an alternative explanation. And I began wondering, why wasn't the Haggadah satisfied with one explanation? Everywhere else, the Haggadah says, you know what this means? It means that. And this is a reference to that, and that's it. Here, all of a sudden, the Haggadah felt the need to say there's an alternative explanation. Let's learn the second explanation, then we'll come back and analyze the relationship between the two explanations. Davar acher, an alternative drasha. Biyad chazakah, and this is going to be multiplication tables. Biyad chazakah shtayim. Yad chazakah, probably because it's two words, references two things. Ubizro nituya shtayim, that's four. Uvemora gadol, again, shtayim. Uva otot, it's in the plural, signs, shtayim. Uva moftim, and signs or wonders, shtayim, also in the plural. Elu eser makot, that's a reference to the 10 plagues. Shevi HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Mitzrim b'Mitzrayim, and then we enumerate them. Ve'elu heim dam, tzvardei akinim arav dever shchin, barad arba, choshech maka pechorot. Then we do the simanim, ditzach hadash ba'achav, and then we're off to the races. There were 10 plagues, there were 50 plagues. There weren't 50 plagues, there were 200 plagues. Do I hear 250? There were 250 plagues. Great, dayenu, and then we're done. But before we're done, and before we dip our fingers into the wine, let's take a moment and try to figure out what are these two drashot telling us. So I get the second drasha, leaving aside the multiplication piece, which I think is a function of either the plural language or the double wording of each of the phrases. The second drasha is fairly straightforward. This pasuk, which the farmer said in Yerushalayim when he brought his bikurim, and which we say at the Seder, is referencing the fact that God took us out of Egypt by punishing the Egyptians with 10 plagues. That's the story that's being told. What story is being told in the first midrash when we reference dever, cherev, gilui shchina, mateh, and dam? What is the first midrash conveying? What's it about? What are these things? What's the message of this first midrash? Like I said, we never stop to think about this. And why do we need two different explanations? The second explanation is perfectly fine. In fact, if you look at old Eretz Yisrael Haggadot, they only had the second explanation. This first explanation was not in all the Haggadot. Somehow it came down, it was incorporated in, and we have two different explanations for one seemingly straightforward pasuk. Pasuk tells us God did lots and lots of things. Mighty hand, outstretched arm, great manifestations, signs, wonders, wonderful stuff, and took us out of Egypt. So what are these 5 things that this drasha in the first drasha hits upon? Well, let me ask it a different way. Okay, so the simplest explanation, or the conventional explanation, is that there's no real difference between the two midrashim. They're both focusing on kind of what God did to the Egyptians in the story. And the second one is kind of neater. The first one's a little bit of a hodgepodge. But it's also kind of focusing on the things that happened to the Egyptians. That's in fact what the Shibbolei Aleket, if you look under B, the difficulties of the first midrash and proposed solutions, I have a quote there from one of the Italian Rishonim known as the Shibbolei Aleket, where he explains this davar acher and the relationship between the two as follows. Davar acher b'yad chazakah shtayim, ad heina, up until now, the first midrash, piresh hapsukim binyan echad. The verse was interpreted, and we proved from them in one direction, v'ochiach mehen ktsat me'amakot shelaku. Some of the plagues, a few of the plagues that the Egyptians experienced. V'ata, but now, rotzeh lo'ochiach mehem kol eser makot. Now we want to explain all 10 makot, shelaku mitzrayim b'yad chazakah shtayim, v'zron etiyah shtayim, and that's why this davar acher, it's not fundamentally different than the first midrash, it's just more comprehensive. Okay, the problem is, Yajin.
Yeah, I think the first midrash is more of like an armed rebellion. It's describing, like the staff, the sword, human contribution.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, so I think the staff and the sword work for that.
Right.
I'm not sure about the others.
Right.
So Judy is already picking up on something which is interesting, which is the cherev and the mateh as instruments of war, which we may come back to. But let me ask a different question. What's problematic about that first midrash? Let's take cherev. What's problematic about cherev? Was there ever a sword mentioned in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? I'm not familiar with it. Is anybody familiar with any sword mentioned in the context? Was there a makkah of cherev that we don't know about? Okay. The mateh is also a little strange because when it came to the makot, the mateh was an instrument to bring about the makot, but it itself wasn't what drove the Jews out or punished. It's kind of the instrument that was used to generate it. It itself doesn't have. It's not like it's like a supporting cast thing. It's not one of the main characters or events that transpired.
But it points to human agency.
Okay, good. I like the human agency point. Good. What about Dever and Dam? What makes those two makot so special? Dever?
Dam is the first.
Dam's the first? Okay.
Well, Dam is more of like something of a nest. Dam is more of an nest. Animals will die and locusts will come, but Dam
Okay.
is something that you would
Okay.
actually need some kind of intervention. They couldn't do it on a big scale, right?
Okay. All right.
I don't know why never Dam.
Yeah.
Weren't both of those things the gods of Egypt?
Could be.
The
They're not, but there were lots of gods of Egypt.
The Nile
Yeah.
and the
Yeah. We don't have a full inventory of all the gods of Egypt, but yes, it may have been that all the plagues were meant as kind of a counteract or to counteract or to almost embarrass the what was understood to be gods of Egypt. You can go through the whole list of them and see. Yeah.
Even the quote for Hacherev is very strange. Karbo shalu fabi yadon to Yerushalayim.
Right, it has nothing to do.
Nothing to do with Egypt.
And like I said, all of these drashot, the reason why we get a little confused, we're going to come back to that, is the first citation is from the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but that's just a coincidence. Really, all the drasha is trying to do is associate the word Yad Chazakah with the term Dever. And that's what that first pasuk does. It happens to be the Makkah of Dever, but we're going to see that's actually part of the reason why the scent is thrown off of what I really think is being conveyed with this midrash. So we're not the first people that struggle with this. I spent one summer holed up in Camp Morashah in the dungeon of the bunk that I live in without any phone access or whatever. Luke can share horror stories with you on trying to reach me in camp. It was pretty terrible. They built a bunk with I think John Nash was the construction person, because there must have been all kinds of aluminum foil blocking any signal into the bunk. All right, so the Rishonim struggle with this very much. If you take a look at the second text below B, the difficulties of the first midrash and proposed solutions, this is a continuation of the Shibalei Elek, and he asks all the questions we asked. The Katav Achira Binyamin Nero, Lama Hiskiru Makadam Umakadever Mikol Eser Makot. What's so special about those two? V'chi Ezo Makat Cherev Matzinu B'Mitzrayim? Do we ever find a plague of swords afflicting Egypt? And the Rishonim bring to bear all of their creativity and ingenuity in trying to answer these five things and explain them, but no one offers a really coherent explanation, and very often the suggestions are problematic. First of all, a lot of them post-date the drasha. This is a Tanaitic drasha that we have in the Haggadah, and many of these, the midrashim that they cite as potential theories to explain, are much later. And then sometimes they resort to gematria. The Shibalei Elek actually says the reason why Dam and Dever are mentioned. What's Dam and Dever? Dam is 44. Dever is 206. What's 206 plus 44? 250. Why is 250 an important number? Because at the end of Magid, we say, you know how many plagues were in Egypt? 250. Okay? If you like gematria, that's fun. Right? But that doesn't appear to be what's going on. And then they try to suggest other kinds of things. He mentions the Midrash in Tehillim, which states that together with each plague, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought Dever with each one. There's a Midrashic tradition that Dever wasn't just its own plague, it was also the wingman of each of the other plagues. I wasn't familiar with this until I saw this explanation. Or if you turn over the page, Cherev, some suggest, you can read this inside, but I'll give you the shortened version in the English. Some suggest that Cherev is not literal, but it's figurative. That it's a reference to the metaphorical sword, which was the Shema Miforash, the tetragrammaton, that the name of God which Moshe invoked to perform the signs and was his quote-unquote sword. Then there's another explanation. This is fascinating. I also wasn't familiar with this until I did this research. According to one Midrashic tradition, the firstborn children of Egypt carried out their own plague on the night of Makat Bechorot. Because when Paro and the rest of Egypt didn't let the Jews go, the firstborn said to the rest of Egypt, you better let them go. Everything that Moshe's predicted will happen has happened. So when you are saying, no, we're not letting them go, and they're saying that they're going to wipe out the firstborn rose up and said, let them go or we're going to kill you. And according to this midrash, the firstborn actually took swords, and it's based on the strange bivcho rehem, the usage of the word with their firstborn, that it wasn't just that the firstborn were killed, but that the firstborn prior to being killed did their own killing. And that's the sword. Okay? The Ra'avan in the source below that says that the firstborn were actually killed with some kind of sword. That it wasn't just that they dropped dead, but that there was a beheading element to when the firstborn were killed.
Then it's not so much of a blackout. It's not miraculous.
Well, it was still miraculous how they were beheaded. It seems like the angel of death beheaded them.
Oh, so
yeah.
It wasn't like their father wielded
Correct. Oh no, but you're right. The previous explanation that it was them themselves. You're right, and it has not. Again, maybe it suggests the human agency that Judy was talking about. But I think there's something else going on here, and I was supremely frustrated trying to figure out what this midrash means, and I stuck with it because I had this sense that if I dug deep enough, I would uncover something about this davar acher. This davar acher was driving me crazy. Why are there two explanations, especially if one is perfectly reasonable, the Eser Makot? I get that. And that appears in all Haggadot. What's this first drasha? It's just this hodgepodge of weird things, the mateh, the cherev, the dever, the dam, the gilui shechina. I had no idea. And then I came across one comment of one Rishon on one element of the drasha, and something clicked. Let's take a look at the under C, a new solution to the first midrash, an alternative narrative. Now, this is a comment of the Orchot Chaim. All of these commentaries, by the way, there's a very useful Haggadah, not for little divrei Torah at the Seder, but if you want to do real research on different passages of the Seder, Torah Chaim, who put out a really great Chumash, has a Haggadah, Torah Chaim, which has all of the Rishonim arranged in the order of the Haggadah, which is very useful because normally you have to take out 6 different books to see all the different Perushim in the Haggadah. This has them all lined up, just like you have in the Chumash and the Mikro Gedolot or the Torah Chaim, all the commentaries right there on the Pasuk. This is the same kind of thing. So I didn't look up each individual commentary. I was able to kind of read through the commentary on those 8 pages where this drasha appears. So here's a comment of Rabbi Aaron ben Yaakov HaKohen Milunel. He's known as the Orchot Chaim. He's from Provence. Lunel is a town in Provence. There's Montpellier and then there's Lunel. Those are the 2 main Jewish centers in Provence in the 13th and 14th centuries. And he makes the following comment, which really, like I said, was a light bulb. Uv'moftim zehadam, perush lo mimakat hayor ka'amar, makat Mitzrayim, ela me'asher hayu ladam bayabashet, ka'asher asa ha'otot le'nei ha'am, shal yidei oto ha'ot ha'eminu bo kol Yisrael. When the Haggadah references the dam in this section, in this first drasha, it's not referring to the plague of blood visited upon the Egyptians through the river. Rather, it's referring to the blood that was on the land when Moshe performed the signs in the eyes of the nation. For through that very sign, all of the Israelites believed in him. What is he saying? What is the dam in that list? It might be useful to put the sheet out like this, so this way you can go back and forth. What is the dam?
It's the blood after the splitting of the sea when all the Egyptians drowned.
Not that blood. Good try. It's not that blood. Earlier, when he first came to Bnei Yisrael, Moshe was given a bunch of signs to perform because Moshe said, I'm going to go to, at the burning bush, Moshe says, I'm going to go to them and they're going to say, who are you? We've been slaves for all this time. Where you been? Who's God? We don't know anything. So God says, I have some signs for you. I got this thing with the tzarad. I got the staff with the snake, and there's another sign which we don't often remember, which is dam. Look at the next source. This is Perek Daled Pasuk Tet in Shmot. V'haya im lo ya'aminu gam l'shnei ha'otot ha'ele. If they don't believe the 2 signs previous, and that was the signs with the staff and with the tzarad, here's what you do. V'lo yishmun l'kolecha, v'lakachta mimei hayor, take some water from the river, v'shafachta ha'yabasha, and throw it on the ground, V'hayu hamayim asher tikach min hayor, v'hayu ledam bayabasha. And that water which you put on dry land, when you take it out of the dry land, it'll become blood. And we read later on in Pasuk Lamed, Vayas ha'otot leinei ha'am, that Moshe performed these very signs, and they believed. Okay, so why did this trigger a light bulb? So it's a little different than what Judy was saying before about the human agency. But if you think about it, what this Orach Chaim is saying on this drush, he doesn't carry it through. It's very frustrating. He notices it in the last one, but he doesn't point to it in the previous drasha. This drasha, this 5-pronged drasha, is not a random catalog of things that happened to the Egyptians. It's actually a list, a sobering list, of things that we needed as Bnei Yisrael in order to believe, and cajoled, coerced, and even threatened to believe and to go out. I'm going to go through each one of them with you in a moment, but wrap your head around the idea that these two midrashim are not just two different ways of saying God smote the Egyptians. They're two different narratives, not mutually exclusive, but certainly fundamentally different and worthy of a davar acher. One narrative, the second narrative, is the one we're familiar with, the one that we focus on at the Seder. We bring little frogs, we bring all kinds of things, we talk about the 10 makot, and we dip, and we do everything, and that's great. But there's another narrative, somewhat unpleasant, but there, and I think it's important that we uncover it and discuss it. And that narrative is, you know what? We didn't fully get on board from beginning to end. There were a lot of ups and downs with our reaction. Yes, we originally believed, but then when the work increased and Paro said, I'm not giving you a straw, we lost faith. Yes, we eventually did Korban Pesach, but all along the way, it seems as if we weren't all that distinguishable from the Egyptians. And so the thesis that we're proposing is that these two drashot are not just two different ways of saying the same thing, but it's two different stories, two different central aspects of the story, two different vantage points. One is the vantage point of what happened to the Egyptians, and we're thankful for that, and that's a wonderful thing, with the caveat that we take out the wine. And then the other narrative, which is one which forces us to confront, warts and all, how the Israelites themselves reacted in Egypt. Let me prove that. Let me try to prove that to you. Let's work backwards. Uba otot. Right? We asked, why is the mateh so central if all it did was bring about plagues? Well, now the mateh makes a lot of sense, because the mateh was an instrument not to create plagues only, but originally was the instrument through which Bnei Yisrael believed. It had a central role when Moshe first approached Bnei Yisrael. Right? That's what we reference. Vet hamateh zeh tikach biyadecha asher taseh bo et haotot. What about Gilui Shechina? What was that referencing? So that's not referencing stuff that happened to the Egyptians, the divine revelation to the Egyptians. That's referencing the divine revelation that God shared with Moshe and Aaron, and by extension, all of Bnei Yisrael while they were in Egypt. God revealed himself to them and instructed them what to do. There's a verse in Shmuel, which I discovered, attests to that fact. This is number 3 under letter C. Vayavo ish Elokim el Eli vayomer elav ko amar Hashem haniglo nigleti el beit avich biotam b'mitzrayim leveit paro. Thus says the Lord, did I reveal myself unto the house of your father when they were in Egypt in bondage to Paro's house? Right? What does this pasuk affirm? That there was Gilui Shechina, there was divine revelation to Moshe and Aaron, at least, while we were in Egypt. And that was a necessary element to get us out. And lastly, here's the clincher. We had, why Dever? Now we understand Dam, but because Dam was one of the signs. But where does Dever come from, and where does Cherev mentioned? This is an amazing thing. when Moshe first goes to Paro, there's a very complicated exchange between them. There's a number of back and forth. It sounds like they're not really talking to each other, they're talking past each other. But Moshe says something that we overlook in that exchange, which pertains to this point. If you look, number 4, Dever v'cherev, Shmot Hei Gimel, Vayomru Elokei Ha'ivrim Nikra Aleinu. They said, meaning Aaron and Moshe say to Paro, the God of the Hebrews has met with us and told us, Nel chana derech shloshet yamim bamidbar v'nizbacha la'Hashem Elokeinu. Let us go, we pray thee, 3 days journey into the wilderness and sacrifice unto the Lord our God. Why? Pen yifga'enu b'dever o b'cherev. There is dever and cherev. But what is the dever and cherev here? Not stuff that was going to happen to the Egyptians. Moshe and Aaron seem to say to Paro, if we don't go out, if you don't let us out, now Paro's not convinced by this, he doesn't care, but if you don't let us go out, we're cooked. We, Bnei Yisrael, have a mission. God wants us to go out to the desert, and he wants us to demonstrate sacrifice, etc., whatever it is, and why he asked for 3 days and not for more is a complicated topic for another time. But what is Moshe saying here? Moshe and Aaron seem to be saying here, if we don't go out, we're in danger. It wasn't just the Egyptians who were punished, but it's also that Bnei Yisrael, if they don't do what they're supposed to do, they are threatened with dever and cherev. And so perhaps what we see here is that this first midrash is telling us another story. The story about what Bnei Yisrael needed in order, the threats that they needed, the signs that they needed, the revelation that they needed, in order to be on board with going out. And the truth is, this counter-narrative is one that we're familiar with. We just have to look a little more closely for it. In Perek Vav of Shmot, we read that after Bnei Yisrael experience a setback, when Moshe first goes to Paro, Hashem tells Moshe, go tell them the 4 stages of redemption, the Arba Lashonot of Geulah, V'hotzeti, V'itzalti, V'lakachti, V'ga'alti. Everything's going to be great. I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to take you out. We're going to do all this great stuff. And what do we read in the bold section? V'lo shamu el Moshe mikotza ruach u'me'avodah kasha. Bnei Yisrael didn't listen. They were overworked, but also they didn't have faith. Kotza ruach, according to some, is a real indictment of the fact that they didn't believe. And the reason why they didn't believe, according to Yechezkel, in the paragraph below, is because they were totally immersed in Egyptian society, avodah zarah, etc. So there's another story of the Seder, which again, sometimes we maybe don't want to share, but which is important to, I think, raise. And I think you can go even further with this. You can talk about how, turning the page, how many of Bnei Yisrael didn't get out, right? According to one midrashic tradition, 4/5 or 499 500ths of Bnei Yisrael didn't survive Makat Choshech. That's the shorter midrash here. Davar acher v'chamushim alu echad mechamisha v'yesh omrim echad mechamishim v'yesh omrim echad mechamesh meot. Only 1 in 500 Jews actually got out of Egypt. And yes, the story is a redemptive one, and in the crucible of in that moment where we were tested, we were able to transform ourselves through Korban Pesach, which again was another Egyptian deity which they sacrificed and which they publicly snatched and then painted on their doorposts. And we did, in the end, redeem ourselves. We didn't have, according to the Midrash, any mitzvot that made us worthy of redemption until we stepped up and did the Korban Pesach and declared our allegiance to God. But along the way, it was quite a bumpy ride. It was not at all a straightforward, ascending, fairy tale kind of narrative. We were lowly and slaves. Then we got out and everything was fantastic. What the Seder, I think, is trying to tell us, what this drasha is trying to hint to us, and why it's not more overt is a good question. I think part of our job is to reveal that which is somewhat hidden. What it's trying to tell us is that this story is a complicated one, and that the more we delve into the complexities of Bnei Yisrael's reactions along the way, the greater an appreciation and understanding we'll have for the three-dimensionality of the story. It's not, one unidimensional. It's not even, two dimensions. These were real challenges that Bnei Yisrael confronted along the way. And I think there's even further you can go. And sometimes we've talked about this at our family's seders. Some people attribute karpas, which we dip into the salt water. Originally, the karpas was dipped into charoset. And some people say that that's a symbolic, right at the start of the Seder, it's reenacting the dipping of Yosef's tunic in the blood. It's just another way to highlight how do we get down to Egypt in the first place. It was through kind of this internecine battle within the family that they were fighting. And again, you can go as far as you want with this or not, but I think what's fascinating is that this drasha really tells us, the Davar Acher tells us, there are two stories here that we have to keep track of. There's the story of the Makod and what happened to the Egyptians, but there's also the story of what happened to us and what was necessary for us to ultimately pick ourselves up and through some human agency actually get ourselves out of Egypt. And what became clear as I thought more about it is that the narrative device of Matkil Begenut U'Mesayim B'Shevach is actually much more complicated than just start with the bad and end with the good. Because if you look at the Haggadah, we kind of go back and forth. We don't have one straight ascending narrative. We have kind of a zigzag, an oscillating narrative. We do Avadim Hayinu Lefaru B'Mitzrayim, and then we say Vayotzienu Hashem Elokeinu Misham B'Yad Chazakav V'Zorah Nitiyah. We were slaves, and then God took us out and redeemed us. But then we go back a little later on and say Mitchilei Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. We were originally idol worshippers. V'achshav Kirvanu Hamakom Baruch Hu Avodato, and now we serve God. And then at the very end of Arami Oved Avi, we also, within that one little drasha, talk about both the Gnut and the Shevach. We talk about the shame and the disgrace and some of the failures that failures of Bnei Yisrael along the way, and then also the ultimate redemption and the salvation that we were able to get out of Egypt. So the first time that I researched this issue was 3 years ago. It was in 2013. I gave this as a Shabbat Hagadol drasha in my shul that year. It was a few days after Rabbi Hershel Schachter had passed away, so I dedicated it in his memory. Right before Pesach, a book came out which I read right away because it's called The Secrets of Happy Families, and if there's a book on that subject, I'm going to try to buy it because I'm looking for that secret. It's an elusive. What? Yeah, I was. I'm trying. Secrets of Happy Families. So Bruce Feiler, who's written a number of really interesting books, he's a Jewish guy who's written on faith and other things. He wrote a book on Abraham, I believe. He's written a few popular books in the last 10 years or so. So there was an excerpt in the Times of the book, which was what got me to buy the book, which I think really speaks to what we're doing at the Seder and really speaks to this particular kind of warts and all unpleasant truths that in order to really tell the story of the Jewish people, you really have to tell the whole story and not hold back. So I'll take a few moments and read this to you because I think it's really really good. I hit the breaking point as a parent a few years ago. It was the week of my extended family's annual gathering, and we were struggling with assorted crises. My parents were aging, my wife and I were straining under the chaos of young children, my sister was bracing to prepare her preteens for bullying, sex, and cyber stalking. Sure enough, One night, all the tensions boiled over. At dinner, I noticed my nephew texting under the table. I knew I shouldn't say anything, but I couldn't help myself and asked him to stop. Kaboom! My sister snapped at me to not discipline her child. My dad pointed out that my girls were the ones balancing spoons on their noses. My mom said none of the grandchildren had any manners. Within minutes, everyone had fled to separate corners. Later, my dad called me to his bedside. There was a palpable sense of fear I couldn't remember hearing before. Our family's falling apart, he said. No, it's not, I said instinctively. It's stronger than ever. But lying in bed afterwards, I began to wonder, what was he right? What is the secret sauce that holds a family together? What are the ingredients that make some families effective, resilient, and happy? It turns out to be an astonishingly good time to ask that question. The last few years have seen stunning breakthroughs in knowledge about how to make families, along with other groups, work more effectively. Myth-shattering research has reshaped our understanding of dinner time discipline and difficult conversation. Skipping to the next underline. After a while, a surprising theme emerged. The single most important thing you can do for your family may be the simplest of all. Develop a strong family narrative. I heard this idea from Marshall Duke, a colorful psychologist at Emory. In the mid-1990s, Dr. Duke was asked to help explore myth and ritual in American families. There was a lot of research at the time into the dissipation of the family, but we were more interested in what families could do to counteract those forces. Around the time, Dr. Duke's wife, Sarah, psychologist who works with children with learning disabilities, noticed something about her students. The ones who know a lot about their families tend to do better when they face challenges, she said. Her husband was intrigued and along with a colleague, Robin Feibush, set out to test her hypothesis. They developed a measure called the Do You Know scale. You can Google that. They asked children to answer 20 questions. Examples included, do you know where your grandparents grew up? Do you know where your mom and dad went to high school? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know an illness or something really terrible that happened in your family? Do you know the story of your birth? Dr. Duke and Dr. Feibush asked those questions of 4 dozen families in the summer of 2001 and taped several of their dinner table conversations. They then compared the children's result to a battery of psychological tests the children had taken and reached an overwhelming conclusion. The more children knew about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believed their families functioned. The Do You Know scale turned out to be the single best predictor of children's emotional health and happiness. We were blown away, Dr. Duke explained. And then something unexpected happened. 2 months later was 9/11. As citizens, Dr. Duke and Dr. Feibush were horrified like everyone else, but as psychologists, they knew they had been given a rare opportunity. Though the families they studied had not been directly affected by the events, all the children experienced the same national trauma at the same time. The researchers went back and reassessed the children. Once again, Dr. Duke said, the ones who knew more about their families proved to be more resilient, meaning they could moderate the effects of stress. Why does knowing where your grandmother went to school help a child overcome something as minor as a skinned knee or as major as a terrorist attacks? The answers have to do with the child's sense of being part of a larger family, Dr. Duke said. Psychologists have found that every family has a unifying narrative, he explained, and those narratives take one of 3 shapes. Here's the Matchil B'Gnut U'Masayim B'Shevach point. First, the ascending family narrative. Son, when we came to this country, we had nothing. Our family worked. We opened a store. Your grandmother went to high school. Your father went to college, and now you. Second is the descending narrative. Sweetheart, we used to have it all. Then we lost everything. The most healthful narrative, Dr. Duke continued, is the third one. It's called the oscillating family narrative. Dear, let me tell you, we've had ups and downs in our family. We built a family business. Your grandfather was a pillar of the community. Your mother was on the board of the hospital. But we also had setbacks. You had an uncle who was once arrested. Don't we all? We had a house burned down. Your father lost a job. But no matter what happened, we always stuck together as a family. Dr. Duke said that children who have the most self-confidence have what he and Dr. Feibush call a strong intergenerational self. They know they belong to something bigger than themselves. Leaders in other fields have found similar results. Many groups use what sociologists call sense-making, the building of a narrative that explains what the group is about. Dr. Duke recommended that parents pursue similar activities with their children. Any number of occasions work to convey this sense of history. Holidays, vacations, big family get-togethers, even a ride to the mall. The hookier the family's tradition, the more likely it is to be passed down. Decades of research have shown that most happy families communicate effectively. But talking doesn't mean simply talking through problems, as important as that is. Talking also means telling a positive story about yourselves. When faced with a challenge, happy families, like happy people, just add a new chapter to their life that shows them overcoming the hardship. This skill is particularly important for children whose identity tends to get locked in during adolescence. The bottom line, if you want a happier family, create refine and retell the story of your family's positive moments and your ability to bounce back from the difficult ones. That act alone may increase the odds that your family will thrive for many generations to come. So when I read this, it struck me that that's what this piece, that's what the Seder overall is about. You know, there's no greater rabbinic text which has this kind of oscillating narrative than the Haggadah, but specifically that little section of Arami Oved Avi takes a pasuk and then tells us two stories, and one of those stories is about ourselves and about how Bnei Yisrael went through many ups and downs and trials and tribulations, moments where they lost faith, and then ultimately they were able to experience the salvation from Egypt and earn and merit to become the people that the nation that we became. And I think one of the messages of the Seder overall is to how to use the telling of the story and the traditions that form around the Haggadah as a means for building our connection and, of course, our extended family's connection to Jewish tradition and the like. And I want to just conclude, we have a couple minutes, with a quote of the Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet, who is the Alter Rebbe of Gur, the first Ger Rebbe, has a beautiful quote in one of his Pesach Drashot. This is the last little quote here, and I think, to me, it captures what hopefully we were able to do today, and also challenges us to try to do it at our own seders. What does it mean that anyone who increases or adds to the stories when it comes to the Exodus, they are praiseworthy? Perush ki yetziat Mitzrayim yotzei mikoach el hapoel al yedei hasipur. The Exodus from Egypt goes from an abstract idea to a lived reality through story, through telling the story, right? It's this abstract idea, and then we tell the story and it becomes something real. That's really what Torah learning is all about, is taking the abstract Torah concepts and revealing them. V'zeh kochan bapeh, and that's the power of word. Shal yidei shemotzin advarim bapeh, when the words come out of your mouth, megalin hatamim hanistarim lavo lidei gilui, you allow that which is hidden to be revealed. V'gam gu'ulah ha'achrona, he concludes, and the final redemption, tiyeh kishi yitbarer kol hanistarot shebiyitzim Mitzrayim. The final redemption will only come about when we reveal all the hidden elements of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So I hope that today we uncovered one hidden message embedded within the text of the Haggadah, the idea of what Bnei Yisrael experienced and what they were going through during the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and through that hopefully will contribute to our Seders and hopefully the ultimate redemption. Have a great day. And Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Have a great Pesach.